I've been designing and teaching philosophy courses at colleges and universities for over 15 years, and if I had to put together a new course on the essential works of political philosophy, here's the 5 texts that I'd choose. First off, Plato's Republic, perhaps the best known philosophy text in global history. Plato takes a philosophical approach to politics, wondering not about concrete existent political systems, but about what are the ideal foundations that ought to ground political reality. This text really introduced the idea of justice and the idea that justice should be the cornerstone of political formation into the Western tradition. There's some surprising conclusions here, such as that children should be raised communally by parents of the community as a whole rather than by individual biological parents, and that the leaders of the city should themselves be philosophers who rotate and who have little privileges from their position. Next up, also from the ancient Greek period, Aristotle's Politics. Whereas Plato had focused on what an ideal city should look like, oriented around the notion of justice, Aristotle looks at what different political systems there are and attempts to reach empirical, naturalistic conclusions about what works out there in the world. Another key and influential feature of this book is the conception of human nature that Aristotle provides within it. In particular, the idea that humans are political animals. Just like bees, naked mole rats, or ants, humans live together, and that means that because political systems are naturally oriented and humans are political animals, we can understand politics itself and well-functioning, well-ordered political states as ones that connect with human nature and that fit and do what the natural political order would do for political animals like ourselves. Controversially here, there is a defense of slavery and of naturalized slavery. For Aristotle, different human beings are naturally differentiated from one another and therefore ought to occupy naturally differentiated spots within the political system and within a state or a city. So next, jumping ahead into modernity, here we have Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan from the 17th century. Hobbes lived through the English Civil War when there was a battle basically over whether the parliament or the monarch would be the supreme head of the state. Hobbes took the position of the monarch, that is to say, Hobbes was a royalist. Hobbes thought that monarchy, in particular an enlightened, rational sort of monarchy, would be the best type of political order, not because it achieves the most just ends, but that it achieves the goal of the social contract. Hobbes is one of the first modern social contract theorists who understood our political systems in terms of an implied contract that we sign with one another and with the state, where we forego certain rights and liberties that we would have had in a state of nature in order to enter into a state of society. The famous image from the frontispiece of the book, which you see here on the title page, is Hobbes's idea of Leviathan. This was drawn for the first edition of the book. And the idea here, if you can look closely, is that every citizen gives a little piece of themselves. And in so doing, they join into a greater sovereign authority. That sovereign authority figure is not democratically elected. Rather, it's an authority who operates from the top down, who unifies all executive power into themselves and their judgment, and who, standing in a position of overwhelming force and authority above all other members of society, enforces the social contract and ensures that no individual within society will step out of bounds and take justice into their own hands, so long as the sovereign Leviathan is there. Hobbes's conception of human nature involves a lot of fear and human life being difficult, humans fearing one another, that humans, if left to their own devices, would attack, would steal from one another, could not really be trusted. And so based on that theory of human nature, the notion of political order and of an ideal political system that emerges from that is one that corresponds with humans' frightened, fearful, brutish nature. Here we have the conception of human life being nasty, brutish, and short. Essentially that humans left to their own devices don't do very well. Number 4 is Discourse on Inequality by Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the 18th century. And it's often referred to as either the Discourse on Inequality or the Second Discourse, because Rousseau wrote an earlier discourse on the relationship between the arts and society. In Rousseau's earlier discourse, he focused on the relationship between art and nature, and in this book, he focuses on the relationship between politics and nature. Rousseau's central idea here is that human society represents an imposition upon an otherwise good nature, and that human society is inherently corrupting and painful for human beings. That the human entrance into society and a political order disrupts an otherwise peaceful, egalitarian, natural state, and while necessary, is nonetheless something that ought to be reformed and to be proceeded with very carefully. Rousseau's a critic of the political status quo in his time, in particular monarchies and absolutist states, whereby there's a great deal of inequality. Rousseau thinks that inequality is the fundamental political and social problem, similar to how Plato had thought that justice and injustice was. For Rousseau, modern political orders are fundamentally unequal and have inequality at their core. The problem for Rousseau is that very early in human history, certain certain institutions were founded that were detrimental to human nature. In particular, private property, the putting up a fence around one's own possessions and saying, that's yours, this is mine, or saying, this is mine and stay away. This opens the door onto society and ultimately to a social contract. But for Rousseau, that itself is the origin of inequality. The institution of private property represents the fundamental break with natural social orders. And for Rousseau, in modernity, states have gotten so bad that they desperately need to be reformed. Rousseau's open to ideas of political revolution. Rousseau does think that there are better and worse political orders, and in particular, he's in favor of a sort of rational republicanism that reflects the broad interests and will of human beings. In a later book called The Social Contract, Rousseau sketches out a more detailed vision of a political system and what it would look like in terms of contracts, institutions, written documents. In this text, he's interested primarily with a diagnosis or a critique of modern political states. Hobbes's view of politics was underlined by a vision of human nature whereby humans are fundamentally violent towards one another. Rousseau's vision of human nature, that is the state of nature prior to the entrance into society via the institution of private property and the formation of social contracts. For Rousseau, that earlier state of nature was actually a peaceful, good one, and humans naturally respect one another and have enough, especially if they have enough space, have a certain natural justice, freedom, and equality with one another. And so Rousseau thinks that we have to get back to that natural political past. Finally, jumping into the 19th century, we have the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Marx was a German philosopher who lived out much of his life in England. In this text, we find the introduction of the Marxist program, or the Communist program, in its first defined articulated form. There are many different forms of communism and many different variations on Marxism. It's significant that the text is a manifesto and not a philosophical treatise. In contrast to each of the previous books we looked at, Marx's goal here is not to understand and analyze political systems from the perspective of a philosopher-scholar, but rather to incite change and transformation within the world from the position of a philosopher-activist. Marx is a powerful writer, and this text makes powerful calls to the reader to develop the idea of class consciousness. So Marx defines different social and economic classes that you might have heard of, like the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. Like Rousseau, Marx is interested to critique or diagnose problems with society as he sees it. And, like Plato, he's also interested to envision an ideal future that could be emerged if certain structural and radical reforms were made. Marx also binds together political, social, and economic realities into a coherent view of the political system. Following Hegel, Marx holds that different political orders have certain internal logics or directions of dialectical development. Marx is often called a dialectical materialist in contrast to Hegel, who is a dialectical idealist. And in this text, we see that at play in the sense that history and material forces in the material world does for Marx have a dialectical order or dialectical direction or pattern or logic to it that Marx thinks will bring itself about, and he calls out the reader to take their place in bringing that communist revolutionary future about. This book is without a doubt the most controversial of the five I recommended here, and the idea in recommending it isn't to say that Marx is definitely correct. Whether you agree or disagree with Marx, this book is undoubtedly one of the great political philosophical works of the 19th century and of the Western philosophical tradition as a whole. I hope you enjoyed this look at 5 essential works in political philosophy. Let me know which of the 5 you like best in the comments, and we'll see you again soon.